You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. On the 15th of May 2022, Palestine Action Group based in the UK staged a protest outside the Bristol headquarters of an Israeli arms company. As part of the protest, Palestine Action aimed to disrupt Elbit Systems operations and smashed its windows to gain access to the site and barricade themselves inside. While the UK branch of Elbit Systems say they do not supply the Israeli military, Elbit Systems works very closely with the Israeli military, and the company says its unmanned drones are the backbone of the IDF. 7 activists involved with the protest that day were arrested and put on trial. All 7 were convicted, but in March 2024 were all given suspended sentences and allowed to walk free. Of the 7, 2 protesters were Israeli dissidents, and we are now joined by one of them, Ronnie Barkan. Ronnie Barkan is an Israeli dissident, co-founder of the Boycott from Within, and a member of Palestine Action. On Nakba Day 2022, he participated in the direct action against the UK headquarters of the Israeli-based Elbit Systems. Elbit is Israel's #1 arms manufacturer and currently has boots on the ground in Gaza who help carry out the genocide. Most recently, Barkan was harassed by the German secret police following his Munich talk of Professor-Huber-Platz, where he connected the legacy of the White Rose, who opposed Nazism, with direct action in opposition to Zionism. Ronnie Barkan, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And it's our pleasure to have you. So I want to sort of go back a little bit before we sort of get into the sort of main area of conversation, which will be this protest that you guys did 2 years ago at Elbit Systems. And I wonder if we can sort of go back to the very beginning of, how, you obviously at some point became an activist. You've done quite a lot of things, Boycott Within and so on. But there was a sort of time where you obviously weren't an activist and then you became one. And you sort of mentioned to me in the emails that there was a particular case, the case of Mohammed Zaza, who was a 15-year-old boy who was injured by the IDF. I wonder if you could sort of take us back to how you sort of got involved politically.
So I grew up in not a very political household, not a very Zionist household, but nonetheless mainstream in its thinking. So I was not too indoctrinated, but indoctrinated enough via the path that every Israeli child goes through. We are literally being taught to be soldiers from kindergarten. Actually, nowadays, I say that even before kindergarten, before we are even born, already as a fetus, there's, for example, an ad for a maternity ward showing a fetus in the womb, and the fetus is wearing a military beret and giving a salute. So, and this is an ad for a maternity ward. It says, well, you should have your baby here with us, because if you do that, your child will also be a decorated soldier in 20 years from now. So this is kind of the mentality of this Sparta state that is beyond militarized. It is a fascist, ultranationalist state that does not make the distinction between civilian and military life. And I'll give you another example just because we're at it. In the days when people used to listen to radio, the most popular radio station, and also the best one of them all, was the military radio station. The thing is that there was no distinction between the military radio station and all the other non-military ones, civilian ones. They had the same news, they had the same programs, only that actually the better quality one was the military. So it just kind of tells you in what society I grew up in. And in that type of society, there was no questioning of the army. But I kind of had a bit of a different view about things. I think when people ask me kind of what made me a little different, I like to say that I was lucky, but also I think that I don't give too much importance to words. I listen, but I also kind of try to see what's behind the language. And we see this happening a lot with politicians, for example, where they say one thing and they mean something very different. So I went through basically 6 years of contemplating, of thinking about whether I'm willing to be a soldier or not, even though there's mandatory military service in Israel. So 3 years of high school and then 3 years of university. And I went to university because I had that option. And by doing that, I actually postponed that decision about whether I'm willing to serve or not. Throughout these 6 years, I was thinking about it. I didn't want to be a soldier, but unless I did anything to oppose it, I would end up being a soldier. And that's what happened. I didn't oppose it because I had no one to talk to. I didn't even know the term conscientious objector. It just didn't exist in my world. So I ended up getting drafted. I literally had no one to talk to about these things. And then 2 months into the army, I had this eureka moment, this realization. The first realization was actually about becoming vegetarian. Nowadays I'm vegan, but I had this insight that I have a choice in the matter. And I went along with what I felt most wholesome about. And a week later, another insight, which was, it's time to leave the army. And again, I went with what was most wholesome. And I had a choice between killing that person and not killing that person, oppressing that person and not oppressing that person. And the moment I realized that, everything became very clear. So the moment that I realized that basically I have a choice in the matter, and that basically we are being told that if I don't serve in the army, then I'm some sort of a traitor or a parasite. And what I realized at that moment is that the only thing I can be a traitor of is humanity. And the only affiliation, the only obligation that I have is to something that's universal. And the moment that happened, the rest was very clear. At that very instant, I stopped being an Israeli. I stopped being a soldier. I'm a human being. I don't care about the rest. Only thing is that I was already in the system, so it took me quite a while to get out of there. I refused to be a soldier. They refused to release me, and we're fighting each other for quite a while. But luckily for me, I didn't end up doing anything as a soldier. During these 2 months that I actually was willing to give it a chance, since I studied physics at university, they designated me to be in charge of an anti-tank missile project. Luckily, I'm no longer there, but all I did during the first couple of months was sit in a library and read about missiles. And then I had this insight. So that's my story in a nutshell. But the moment that I had this realization, the rest was crystal clear, because we are being told that the situation is complicated, that it's difficult. It's far from being complicated. It's brutal, it's barbaric, it's monstrous at this point. But it's far from being complicated. It's the least complicated conflict in the world, and it's not even a conflict. Okay, so anyone who thinks that, anyone who by now, after 1 year of a live stream genocide, where we see everything that is happening in front of our eyes, played out in front of our eyes in the most gruesome way, if anyone has not figured out by now, then they're basically hopeless. It's as simple as can get, and as brutal as can get.
It's quite a big thing as well, because when you started talking about just how, you didn't have anyone else to speak to, and I think sometimes for people who are obviously not from Israel or been there very much, the extent to which the society is militarized is hard to sort of fathom. You might think, okay, well, every country has an army and all armies have subcultures, but within Israel, there is something kind of different about it from other countries. The fact is, militarization is part of your everyday life. It's, for example, if you're somebody who doesn't serve in the army, it may affect your jobs later on. So when you sort of go up for a job, even if it's as a waiter, the first question you might be asked is, well, which army unit did you serve in? And army radio is also quite an important place for journalists to learn their trade, because of course if you're like 17 or 18 years old and you go into the military, you may well have an idea of a career that you want, and in many cases the army can help you get to that career, even stuff that's not obviously military. So a lot of Israel's entertainment industry, actors, actresses, go through the entertainment sector of the army, and that's how they sort of learn their craft. It's a very militarized society.
Indeed. People think that it's a state with a strong army. Actually, it is an army that has a state. And as I said, there is literally no separation between civilian and military life. And the examples that I can give you are first mind-boggling, secondly, I mean, endless. So the thinking is that of a military society, and that also allows not only obviously it's more aggressive in its very nature, but that also allows to basically disregard anyone who doesn't serve in the army, who is regarded as I mentioned before, a parasite. So that is both a way to disregard, to totally not even give a second thought to those who are second-class citizens, those who are citizens of the state, but are second-class citizens by law, but also they don't serve in the army, so obviously they don't deserve any rights. And also the ultra-Orthodox who are anti-Zionist or not so Zionist, because Zionism is just alien to their way of life, but there's quite a few of them, so they are regarded as the other problem. So you have Israelis have the external enemy, the Palestinians, and then they have the internal enemy, the ultra-Orthodox who are not Zionist, who don't want to be part of the rest of Israeli society. And without these two enemies, the external and the internal enemy, Israeli society would crumble from within. And that relates to how Zionism came into being, of course, as a totally artificial thing that has no cohesion in its own right. So it's a state that it's an army that has a state. Now, people don't know that not only that Israel chose to go to every one of its wars, other than the War of 73, Yom Kippur War, it chose every war, including 48, even though they didn't shoot this first bullet. In 67, they also didn't shoot the first bullet, but they did everything in their power to go to war. But there's more than that. In 67, there was a silent coup, military coup in Israel that people are not familiar with. The prime minister at the time, Eshkol, he said, I'm looking into diplomatic solutions to the issue. And the generals told him, no, we're going to war. And he told them, it seems to me like just because I got you all these planes and tanks, then you're very eager to use them. And they said, it doesn't matter what you tell us, we're going to war. And that's exactly what happened. But even that, a military coup is kind of doesn't really raise an eyebrow because, as I said, there's no real distinction between the two things. Sorry, there was something else that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I was just saying how militarized society was and how it's sort of every aspect of your life is part of it because not only do you have, not only the fact that you have to serve and wider society doesn't look too kindly if you don't serve, there's also, if you're an individual in Israel, it has some benefits to you in the sense that if you've got a specific career you want to go into, the army has a kind of pipeline towards it. And that is across different fields. I mean, I've mentioned
you also mentioned that about going to work, about how military work is related. And personally, I was working in IT at the time when I was living in Palestine. Palestine, Israel, same place. It's all Palestine. You can also, if you're racist, you can call it Israel, but it's the same place. There is no Israel and Palestine. This is part of the propaganda. And we have to utterly reject it. Any statement that says Israel and Palestine is part of Zionist propaganda. There's no Israel and Palestine. Israel is Palestine. They're one and the same. So when I was working in IT, at some point, I had to condition it already at the work interview, job interview, that I'm only working with civilians. And that's what I did. And, if they wanted me, enough, then they would hire me nonetheless. And then while working in IT, which is obviously, basically objective, I mean, it's just technology, they would still try to get me involved in all kinds of military-related projects, etc. And I wouldn't accept that. I remember even a colleague, I was some consultant, and I had my colleague sitting with the Shin Bet, who was a customer. By the way, Shin Bet is referred to as Kaf Daled. They don't even call it by its name, so they came up with other acronym. Kaf Daled is like just a generic like John Doe, Cohen David. So, so my colleague was sitting with the Shin Bet, and he was calling me up, asking for technical questions, and I realized that what was going on, and I asked him, "Is this related to anything specific?" And he told me, and I said, "No, I'm not helping you." call me back later. I'll explain what you wanted to know. So that's how it operates. And so you have to kind of be a little stubborn about it and stand up to things. And it's obviously not that easy in some cases. In my case, I enjoyed it in a way. And also my colleagues who were definitely not politically aligned with me, they would call me up all the time for coffee breaks because they wanted to discuss these issues. It was interesting for them. They didn't agree, but they wanted to argue about it. So that's kind of how I was living my life in Palestine until I had enough of that. First of all, I couldn't stand working in IT with these kind of people. And secondly, I felt that it was basically irresponsible of me to stay in Palestine because I could be much more effective outside in order to change the situation inside. So at some point, I left because I just felt that it was a waste of time in a way, trying, not that it is a complete waste of time, but there is much more that we can do. And especially someone who is a privileged, by law, a privileged Israeli Jew, can say certain things, can do certain things, possibly, that other people can't or won't. Don't regard myself as Israeli or Jewish, but this is my legal status under apartheid.
Yeah, it's interesting because IT was the other industry I was also thinking of in regards to the army's pipeline, because of course Israel has, a tech industry, and a lot of the tech industry, the sort of promises, if you're very good with computers, you can go and serve in the Israeli army units or in the
Yes,
7200 unit,
Yes,
and then you can go on and start a tech company with army backing and stuff.
exactly.
So there's an entire pipeline there as well, which is interesting. But
Yes, and
before
they
you,
take, they take some bright people to go to that unit. It is obviously very highly regarded. They get the best training, and then they are being just snatched by the industry later on. And they are also the founders of many of those startups. They bring in their friends. So you have some startups, and so, which later on some of them become big companies, unicorns even, and they are basically founded by these military, people with military background who bring their own friends from the same unit, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it shows you how there is no distinction between military and civilian life, and that horrible unit 8200 is by now regarded as more of a spy agency than a tech unit of the army. Not to mention that it is part of military intelligence, and the whole term military intelligence is an oxymoron in itself.
indeed, and even like thinking also about when you were there and you were being active and things. I mean, you were part of the boycott within that started kind of early, not too long after BDS itself was announced. And if anyone sort of wants to sort of understand a little bit about the sort of situation you were in, you could easily through YouTube find clips from Israeli television where you're being yelled at on TV. So perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about the sort of reaction to you when you started becoming more vocal.
Yeah. So I mentioned that the moment that I realized that I'm no longer an Israeli and no longer a soldier, I'm just a human being, then I immediately became an activist on the spot. So even while I was still technically in the military, even though I refused to be a soldier, I would already start participating in other events across the fence from that military base, demonstrating in support of other conscientious objectors, which I learned the term by then. It was a revelation for me that there are others. And then I helped other objectors in their process because I had some experience of my own. So I was part of this group called New Profile, which aims to civilize Israeli society, to transform it from a society of soldiers to a society of civilians. I joined the demonstrations in the West Bank with Anarchists Against the Wall that was just formed those days. It was during while they were establishing this annexation wall that was deemed illegal a few years later by the International Court. And the moment that the BDS campaign started, which is the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, I immediately joined that. And a couple of years later, I helped to co-found a group of conscientious Israelis who support the Palestinian BDS call. So it's not that we came up with our call. It was, in analogy to South Africa, it's about the privileged group, let's say, the few privileged white folks who supported the black people in their struggle. So you have the privileged Israeli Jews who support the Palestinians in their just struggle for their very basic rights. So this is what it was about. Obviously, we were regarded and are regarded as traitors in Israel. And this is a badge of honor as far as I'm concerned, especially to be a traitor of Zionism, fascism, and Nazism. That is a badge of honor. I am an anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, and anti-Zionist in every bone, all for the very same reason. Actually, today, I think that Zionism has become synonymous to Nazism. So they are almost interchangeable these days. So that's basically what we are doing within that society. And when I was invited once in a while to participate on Israeli television, then I would have all these interesting encounters, obviously by right-wing anchors and interviewers who would be shouting at me or even cut the interview half midway, but also by self-proclaimed leftists who were shouting at me just as much the moment I referred to what was happening in Gaza as a massacre, and that Israel, just stating the facts that Israel is not a democracy and has never been a democracy. It doesn't have an iota of democracy, that the Israeli army is a terror organization. Just by stating these facts, they just became very loud and aggressive. And that again tells you about how there is no ability to actually question the military or to even question life as basically you have military subjects on one hand, which are the Palestinians, and you have the actual military, which are the civilians on the other side. I mean, they're totally inseparable, the civilians and the military. And also when we talk about geographical locations, you know how Israel likes to claim that Hamas or this or that group is using human shields. Actually, the exact opposite is true. Not only that the Israeli army uses Palestinians as human shields as a matter of policy, because there is no distinction between civilian and military life, you have the military bases like Hakiria, the command control center of Israel, which is situated right at the center of Tel Aviv, surrounded by everything, surrounded by the hospital, actually even with tunnels connecting between the hospital and the military base, according to, external sources, international sources. You have the court, you have the museum, you have residential buildings, you have the mall, the train station connected with a bridge to the train station, the mall connected with a bridge to the military base, just literally across the street. And that's just one example of many. So it is quite outrageous when they talk about how the other side does not distinguish between civilians and combatants, where Israel doesn't even have that concept.
It's interesting as well, the bridge pipe thing to think about, because of course one of the big accusations is Hamas sort of uses tunnels underneath hospitals, and now we're hearing Hezbollah uses tunnels under hospitals, but Israel uses bridges between them to get from base to hospital.
Yes. And tunnels
as well.
Plenty of tunnels that I'm not familiar with, but I know that because some of this is online material. Besides, even back in the day when the Zionists saw themselves as anti-colonialists fighting the British, and they were hiding weapons, for example, to fight the British and to fight Palestinians as well. So you still have to this day, if you walk around Tel Aviv, for example, which is supposedly the liberal progressive city of Tel Aviv, which is just as fascist and militaristic as any other place, even more so, then you will see these plaques commemorating, for example, how in the Great Synagogue there was a cache of arms. Basically, they used to store weapons in that synagogue, and they take pride in that. One of many examples of things that they take pride in. At the same time, they destroyed every mosque that they came across in Gaza, claiming that they somehow stored weapons there.
Yeah, you see all those signs all across the country. I mean, I remember walking past Haifa and stuff, and you would see on the beach or somewhere near there a placard commemorating the execution of British soldiers by Zionist militia groups.
Right.
So, it's and the use of bombings and stuff. So you see all sorts of stuff like this, which are now Palestinians are accused of. You find Zionists and Israeli historians take great pride in the fact that they did the same thing.
Exactly.
So talk to us a bit about the case of Mohammed Zaza, because you mentioned to me this was an important case for you, and this is something that happened, what, 14 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yes, it happened 40 years ago, like 2011. Cousins Mohammed and Ibrahim Zaza from Gaza were hit with a drone missile. They were 15 and 12 years at the time. Ibrahim, the 12-year-old, succumbed to his injuries a month later. Allah yarhamu. And Muhammad survived with multiple injuries throughout his body. He underwent over 33 operations by now and is still recovering and still in need of more operations and care. So in 2011, it was during Ramadan. They were waiting for iftar for the to end the fast, and they were just playing outside of their house in Gaza, and a drone missile hit them. Basically, you can see the hole in the ground. It was basically just in between the two kids, and I have the video where you can see the kids after being hit, laying on the ground in a very, very dire situation. And that was literally a meter away from the fence of a hospital, of a geriatric hospital in Shujaya. Later on, the hospital and the entire neighborhood were razed to the ground in 2014. So they were hit in 2011. A friend of mine heard about the fact that two kids were transferred from Gaza to an Israeli hospital, basically a hospital in 48. And we went to visit, and our lives have been kind of entwined ever since. I've been following the family and Muhammad's case, and throughout the past 13, 14 years, which involved a lot of hardships. Initially, obviously, overcoming the numerous surgeries, a very long rehabilitation process. After a year in Palestine in 48, he had to go back to Gaza. At some point, and he needed more surgeries. He was denied at some point the ability to go back to get more surgeries. They basically tortured him kind of in the checkpoint in the Erez crossing, trying to force him to kind of to collaborate with them as a child. Obviously, he didn't agree with that, and they just kind of treated him badly. And ever since, he was denied the right to get further treatment in Israel or 48. And this carried on. Now, when I'm fast forwarding, I mean, I've been in touch with him ever since, and later on he's been to Turkey, and I've been visiting him there several times. But eventually, when we did the action at Elbit in the UK, there used to be 10 sites, Elbit Systems sites operating in the UK, and due to ongoing direct actions every week, every other week, over the past few years, 3 of those 10 sites have been permanently shut down. And that is very encouraging that we can do something about it. So we went after the London headquarters, the Elbit Systems headquarters in the UK, which was in London, that was shut down. They moved it to Bristol. And then we went to hold an action at the new headquarters in Bristol. And in the video in the little interview that I did just moments before going to that action, I say something like to Muhammad and other drone victims, we are doing this for you. We are doing this so that you and other children will not have to suffer the consequences of these monstrous drones and all kinds of other monstrous tools that are produced by Elbit. So also the motivation for smashing up Elbit Systems headquarters in the UK was in large part because of my direct knowledge of what Muhammad had to endure in his family. his family is still in Gaza in the most dire situation, as we all know. And then during the trial in the UK, which happened a couple of years after the action, Muhammad came to give testimony in the trial, and that was very emotional and a very powerful testimony. He arrived not as an expert witness because the legal system doesn't allow that, even though he is definitely an expert about the outcome, what Elbit is responsible for. We were also denied other expert witnesses, like, for example, Professor Richard Falk, who is a Professor Emeritus of Law, and he was the former Special Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine, what's called OPT, and he was willing to be an expert witness, but the court wouldn't hear any of that. But Muhammad was able to show up as a character witness for me because we know each other for so long. So while talking about my character, he obviously could not talk about how we know each other. So basically, he went through, in short, he told the court, the jury, about what he had to endure, and that was very powerful.
You mentioned the court, since we're now talking about the trial itself. You mentioned the court didn't allow for you to have a number of expert witnesses, including Dr. Richard Faulkner. Could you perhaps explain what reasoning they gave for denying this request?
They don't have to give reasoning. The judge deems it as irrelevant. So you see, the UK has been on a trajectory of denying, of being beyond complicit in Israeli crimes. Well, obviously there's the whole history of being complicit in Zionist crimes since the Balfour Declaration and before that. But more recently, you see, in 2009, after the massacre, the 2008-9 massacre called Cast Lead, some Israeli officials would not show up in the UK. And then they approached the UK administration and they said, this is outrageous. How is it possible that we cannot show up? Because at the time, the UK still had international jurisdiction. It was possible to take these people to court, to take these war criminals to court in the UK. So in response, you had people like former Foreign Minister Hagee, who said that they will be dealing with that. I can even find the direct quote if you want. And this is exactly what they did. In 2011, they changed the law in the UK and removed international jurisdiction. And the way they did it is that they now left that in the hands of the public prosecution, the director of public prosecution, which was at the time Keir Starmer. So when Tzipi Livni, a notorious war criminal, she was also formerly with the Mossad. She is the daughter of two Zionist terrorists from the Irgun. She was supposedly regarded as a leftist in Israel or a centrist. She was the head of the opposition to Netanyahu and was kind of, boasted by all these so-called liberal Zionist organizations in Israel and beyond, like, all these horrible organizations like J Street and others who were embracing her. So that war criminal, she was the first one to test that change of the law. And in 2011, after being invited by the UK, after the Matthew Gold, the UK ambassador to Israel, specifically approached her and told her that she is now invited back. She is the first one to test that new law, and she arrived in the UK. An arrest warrant was filed against her by Daniel Machover, the son of an Israeli dissident, and a great lawyer in his own right. And then, because of that new law, it landed in the hands of Sir Keir Starmer, who decided to lend immunity to Tzipi Livni. 3 years later, Tzipi Livni was responsible for yet another massacre in Gaza, known as Protective Edge, where 551 children have been murdered, 89 families have been completely liquidated, obliterated. And it was Elbit Systems who was not only producing the means of the murder machines, they were producing this new drone called the Hermes 900, which is now their flagship UAV. And because that was still under development, they were there on the ground throughout the entire 51-day assault and also for a whole year later. And they were making every takeoff and every landing of this new drone, while next to them, the Israeli Air Force pilots, the drone pilots, were dropping the bombs, murdering these children, obliterating entire families, including, if you remember, there was the Bakr boys, the 4 boys running on the beach. That was on the second day of the assault on Gaza. And there were 2 Elbit drones in the air. I know that because I was sent the internal military investigation into that murder. And the only reason that there was an investigation is because that was captured by a French TV crew and was aired to the world and caused a big stir. So basically, there were 2 Elbit drones in the air, a Hermes 450, which is a kind of the workhorse of the Israeli Air Force, and the Hermes 900, that new drone that was still under development. And that means that Elbit was on the ground also during the bombardment, the murder of the 4 Bakr boys. 2 missiles were shot at them, 30 seconds apart. 1 child was murdered with the first missile, and as they were fleeing for their lives, they were hunted down and shot at with the second missile. 4 were murdered, 4 were injured. And then, more recently, the same Tzipi Livni, the same war criminal, was elected as director of Elbit Systems. So this is what the UK is responsible for, but they haven't stopped there. They have been changing the law in order to protect the criminals, not only changing, removing international jurisdiction, they have changed their own laws. So at the time, for example, when we did the action in 2022 on Nakba Day, we still had some defenses in the law. But based on the Colson statute trial, some defense in the law has been changed. Later on, other defenses in the law have been changed. And by the time that we had the trial, we had no defenses or hardly any defenses in the law other than one, which is a tricky one. It's called the defense of consent. By now, even that defense of consent, which is totally subjective, it depends on the subjective view of the person acting. It does not depend on facts at all. It's just about the view of the person taking action. Even that defense is no longer relevant to activists. And this was done by the UK in order to basically take people like us who oppose these grave crimes, both pro-Palestinian activists and also environmental activists who are motivated out of the best intentions. The UK has been changing the law in order to be able to take people like us to court and send us to prison. And this is what is happening. We were actually the very first ones from Palestine Action to end up in prison on remand just after the action. Before that, people would be sent home, but we were the first ones to actually be sent to prison for a little while. Stavit and myself spent a month in prison. Our comrades, our co-defendants spent about a week in prison and police custody. And during that 1 month on remand, while we were in prison, we know that the Israeli embassy was communicating with the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, about Palestine Action. You can imagine, we don't know the facts, but you can imagine what they were discussing. We know that the Israeli embassy has been communicating several times with the CPS, which is highly illegal. And not only that, also we know for a fact these days that high-ranking ministers in the UK government have been communicating with the CPS about Palestine Action. So this is how things operate. Those who oppose the crimes are regarded as criminals, denied defenses, being sent to prison, while the British government is doing everything in its power to support the crimes in every possible way, shape, and form. Yeah, I mean, so that's what we are fighting against. At the same time, I'm quite hopeful because there are many good people around the world definitely quite a few people in the UK who will not be silenced. And even though the situation is changing, they have not changed their ways. They have only escalated their activity against these criminals. And the fact that people are willing to put themselves on the line is very important. And actually, part of the idea of direct action, and this is being discussed among people in Palestine Action, part of the idea of direct action is that not only that we need to have focused type of actions. For example, Elbit Systems is a very clear target, which is as criminal and as monstrous as can be. Not only that we need to have ongoing actions, so not just a one-off, but week after week, etc. But also the fact that people are willing to put themselves on the line, that is important, because once you're willing to pay a price, that also creates a dilemma on the other side, on the people who are looking at it. Just like the students across the world, those Ivy League students who are putting their career on the line. And then other people look at them and say, hold on, but why? Why? They're willing to pay a shitload of money to go to these horrible universities, these Ivy League universities. And they are putting their entire career on the line, possibly even at the risk of being expelled from university. Why would they do that? And that creates a dilemma, which is important. It's important because that is what basically changes the perception of people. And people in the UK, for example, seeing these ongoing actions and seeing these people going to court, going to prison, there has become a real movement around that. And even people who have been living in the places where these factories operate, they have come together and said, we don't want this in our backyard. We didn't know what this building was, this unassuming building, but now that we do, we will not have that any longer. And they have started taking action themselves. And this is really encouraging.
Indeed. Before we sort of get on further with the trial itself, you mentioned in your bio that Elbit Systems are on the ground in Gaza, and we've spoken quite a bit about the drone, but are they on the ground in other ways?
Yes. So Elbit Systems is a privately owned company. It is Israel's largest arms manufacturer. It produces everything from ammunition and rifles and missiles, and you name it, and obviously these drones, the big ones, the UAVs that I mentioned, and also the little ones, the quadcopters that are now being used extensively in Gaza. In 2018, these quadcopters have been retrofitted by Elbit per IDF request in order to challenge those Gazans who went on the right of return, on the March of Return. March of Return in 2018, where people in Gaza went to the fence to demand their right, not only against the siege, as some people like to portray it, they were demanding the right to return home. 70% of all people in Gaza are refugees from just across the fence. There's no border between Gaza and the rest of Palestine, just like there was no border between Warsaw Ghetto and the rest of Warsaw and Poland. There's a fence, a highly militarized fence with the best equipment, murderous equipment, mostly produced by Elbit. So people went to demonstrate. The Israeli army approached Elbit and said, we need you to fix that problem. And they took their quadcopters, which can carry quite a large weight, and they retrofitted it with grenade launchers. And at the time, it was used for tear gas grenades, covering the entire area from the air with tons and tons of tear gas at these nonviolent demonstrators. They also retrofitted these quadcopters with machine guns, so they could also shoot bullets, and they also even made it possible for those quadcopters to carry small bombs, small missiles. So, they fly over the target, they just drop it and then return to base, becoming this targeted missile. In 2018, it was used with tear gas canisters. In 2024, 2023, the same quadcopters are being used with live grenades, with rifles, with live bullets, live ammunition, and obviously with missiles. And we hear about how they make the sound of crying children, and then people go out of their hiding and, to search for these children, then they're being hunted down. This is what Elbit-IDF is doing, or we could call it IGF. The Israeli army has never carried out a single act of defense in its entire existence, but These days, it is the Israel genocide forces more than anything else. So Elbit is part and parcel of that. It is producing the murder machines. It is later on selling, it is developing it in close cooperation, in the closest cooperation possible with the Israeli army and other security apparatus. They are perfecting it literally on the bodies of Palestinians. They have an entire lab called the Gaza Strip. There's actually a very good film called The Lab, which talks about that. And then they sell it to the rest of the world as being battle tested. Now, not only that, Elbit has boots on the ground, as I mentioned. In 2014, we know that they were making every takeoff and every landing of the Hermes 900, for example. And nowadays, and I invite the audience to listen to these interviews on Elbit podcast, Elbit website. They have a podcast where they interview their workers, and some of them talk about, boast about the excitement of working for Elbit because they don't only sit in the office all the time, that they also go out to the field to work with the soldiers in Gaza right now.
That's quite an extraordinary thing to actually even have
I
a
should
podcast.
mention, Elbit, I said that they produce pretty much everything. Really, everything that is being used in Gaza has an Elbit logo on it in one way or another. Parts of, it could be not the entire tank, but some of parts of that tank, etc., and so on. But also, Elbit produces white phosphorus and cluster munition, which is illegal to be used in a civilian on a civilian population, which has been used numerous times in Lebanon and in Gaza.
It's quite extraordinary to think about just how they even have a podcast talking about it. It's quite. I can't think of any other defense company that has even a podcast about their sort of activities. But do we know much about? Because obviously, we're hearing a lot about its work with the Israeli army. But do we know who else they sort of sell their weapons to? Do we have much information on which other countries are purchasing their products?
Oh, yeah. So both within Israel and abroad. So within Israel, we know we had the first high-ranking official from Elbit UK. Elbit UK is part of Elbit Israel. It's just the UK branch of Elbit Israel. There's no distinction, even though Elbit UK tries to claim that there is. So that high-ranking official, the VP of Sales, Alan Wright, gave testimony in our trial in Bristol. And he seemed to suffer from amnesia. He couldn't remember anything. Being the VP of Sales, he couldn't even remember what Elbit was selling and to whom. But at the same time, he did acknowledge a few things because he had no choice. Some things he had to say a yes or no answer to. So, for example, he acknowledged that Elbit Israel, there's a very strong overlap between the directors of Elbit UK and the high-ranking officials, including the director and president himself of Elbit Systems Israel. The directors, the know-how, the machines, you name it. Also, people go back and forth between the two places. I have proof of that. Now, other than that, he acknowledged that the ultimate, obviously, the profits go all the profits from the UK go to Elbit Israel, and also that the ultimate decision comes from the Israel. If the Israeli company, Elbit Israel, or let's call it just Elbit Systems, it's all one. If Elbit Systems decides to shut down their operation in the UK or to move it around or to do whatever to change, it's totally up to them. They have the ultimate decision here. They are the decision makers. Another thing that he mentioned, he couldn't remember, or he said that Elbit in the UK does not send anything to the Israeli army, but they do send to Elbit in Israel, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, works in close cooperation with the army, and we know for a fact that they are the main suppliers of the Israeli army. The engines, at least for the Hermes 450, which is the workhorse, where the Israeli Air Force commander boasted about how they have tiled the airspace of Gaza, that there's not an inch that is not being surveyed 24/7 by numerous drones. The engine is produced in the UK by an Elbit subsidiary. Okay, we know that for a fact. Another thing that he mentioned is that that same facility that produces the engines also sends the engines to IAI, the Israeli aerospace industry, which is not a private company, it's a governmental owned company in Israel. And this engine is part of their suicide drones because they also have a line of suicide drones. Okay, so that's as far as Israel is concerned. In a nutshell, there's much more to be discussed. I have researched this for well over a year while I was under house arrest. Now, at the same time, Elbit has been selling to the most despotic regimes around the world, even those who commit genocide, like Myanmar. They've been selling before, during, and after the genocide, even after the Israeli court itself told Elbit that they are no longer allowed to sell to Myanmar. They carried on selling in violating the Israeli court's decision. They have not only sold to genocidal regimes and the most despotic regimes, knowing full well where this is going. They have even been actively involved in basically rewriting history when they were selling weapons to, I think it was Bulgaria, if I'm not mistaken. And in order to kind of whitewash Bulgarian basically collusion with the Nazis at some point, it was Elbit that funded a whole revisionary book about Bulgarian history, absolving it of its crimes, and you have an Elbit logo on that book. It's totally, it's absurd. It's kind of unbelievable the extent to which they go. Now, when we go to smash up a factory, the analogy that I give to that is, if my grandmother, who was in Auschwitz, knew that someone was picking up a sledgehammer and was going to Degesh factory, which was producing Cyclone B, and was going to smash up that factory, she would have been very grateful for that. Maybe her family would not have been exterminated. And Elbit is far more monstrous than that company, Nazi company that was producing Cyclone B, and I say that for a fact. Elbit is far more monstrous than that. They are not only producing the means of destruction, they are actually actively carrying out the genocide as we speak.
Indeed, indeed. And when you sort of carried out this action, what do you feel, when you sort of did the direct action at the Bristol branch of Elbit Systems, what do you feel that achieved?
Obviously, a single action does not stop the war machine. But I think that the fact that they sent us to prison, the fact that the Israeli embassy was communicating with the CPS, and all of that tells us that we have achieved something. Just because they are afraid, we know that if they are afraid, we have done something right. I think that through all these different actions, which are ongoing week after week, now the UK is using terrorism charges against Palestine actionists in order to take them, to basically put them in prison. Right now, there are quite a few wonderful, courageous people who are behind bars, and they deserve all the support. And I encourage all the listeners to go to Palestine Action website and see what they can do. They can sign up to the Solidarity Network and so on. Even sending a solidarity message from outside, you can do that by email. This is kind of a breath of fresh air when you're in prison. It's really great to hear these nice words coming from outside, and just to talk to sane human beings on the outside in this, these halls of oppression, which are the prison. So I think that through these ongoing actions, we know that facilities have been shut down. Elbit has been losing also financially, and they only care about the bottom line anyway. And also, it is about exposing the truth of the matter, exposing what Elbit is all about, exposing what Israel is all about. And I think that actually Israel has been very good at exposing its true face over the past year. Unfortunately, it's not so much thanks to us, activists who have been trying to talk about how horrible and monstrous Zionism is. I've been doing that for a few decades now. It's actually Israel that has managed to expose its true face to the world. But now that basically the genie is out of the bottle, now that they have exposed themselves for what they really are, there's no going back. Now the question is, what can we do to usher in the dismantlement of the Zionist system of oppression, domination, and terror, and now genocide? What is the most effective thing that we can do in order to bring about the end of the Zionist system sooner rather than later? And it is in our hands. Obviously, it's in the hands of the politicians who are participating in crime, but in most parts of the world, the people, unlike their politicians, are very much on the side of Palestine, and there is a lot that can be done. And I think that any form of disruption is important. It can even be a legal form of disruption. And going back to, you mentioned the White Rose. I'm here in Munich right now. Munich was the center, the epicenter in a way of Nazism at the time. And in Munich, very important things happened also in terms of opposition to Nazism. You had the wonderful people of the White Rose, the Weiße Rose, who were students and their professor, Professor Huber. And they have managed to spread some leaflets in support, anti-Nazi leaflets in support of the rights of Jews and others. But not only that, it wasn't only about the rights and not only about against Nazism. It was in their leaflet number 3, they wrote about the need for sabotage. They say sabotage of the war machine, sabotage of every place that is participating in that crime. So, they reiterate and they even write it in bold, sabotage, sabotage, sabotage. And they have done that at great risk. They have literally paid with their lives for doing that, for simply distributing flyers. Okay? Even if we are being sent to prison, most of us don't, we are not looking at facing the guillotine as they did. We can do much more, and we need to do much more in order to sabotage the system in one way or another, even in a legal way, to disrupt the system and bring about the end of the Zionist monstrous system sooner rather than later.
And what do you, obviously, currently right now you're in Germany, and we mentioned in the intro that you were in fact detained because of a speech you were giving in Germany. But thinking about, if we had another hour, we could go into a lot about Germany. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time. But thinking about the sort of future now, thinking about, well, not too far into the sort of near future, with everything that's happening in right now with Israel bombing, obviously Gaza's continuing, Lebanon, they've, intensified the war there, possible strikes on Iran. What do you sort of see as being the sort of future of all of this? What's going to happen, do you think?
So I think there is some kind of, it can play out in different ways. And it is, again, in our hands, in a way, about how much pressure we apply. And when I say we, it's everyone around the world. I wish that the politicians did what they're obligated to do, but they don't. So it's up to us first to demand it of them and also to do stuff ourselves. But there's one more thing that I want to mention about Munich. I gave a talk about following the legacy of the White Rose and direct action for Palestine and connecting the two things. The head of the Weiße Rose Stiftung, the head of the White Rose Museum and the organization that's running it, is a rabid Zionist. And she negates, for example, that Israel is committing a genocide. And when I went to the museum with a Palestine Action shirt, the first thing she asked me was, did I give a talk across the street? And I said, yes, of course I did. And I was talking a little bit about, the need to oppose a genocide and seriously talking about the legacy of the White Rose, about my grandmother and my grandparents being survivors of the Holocaust and so on. And that Zionist who is heading the Weiße Rose Stiftung, she negated there was a genocide. She practically kicked me out of that museum, the White Rose Museum. And she also participated in on the 6th of October, there was a Zionist event here in Munich, basically, about a very much anti-Palestinian Zionist event about the 7th of October. Okay. I go back to the words of the White Rose. They talked about the petty villains and that we should never forget the petty villains. And the petty villains, in our case, are all those, for example, and I'll mention two or three. One is, yes, the head of the White Rose Society, the same person who is supposed to actually maintain the legacy of the White Rose, those who opposed the previous genocide that Germany was running, the second genocide, this is the third genocide that Germany is carrying out. Those who opposed the second genocide of Germany, she is negating their legacy right now. Another two that I want to mention are, again, relating to Germany, are Amnesty International Germany. Unlike Amnesty International around the world, the Berlin branch of Amnesty International, while in 2022, while Amnesty International published the report, a very good report about apartheid, accusing Israel of committing the crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, classified as such, the Berlin branch said, we will not do anything about that. We will not talk about it. We will not take out any action. They acknowledge that the report exists, but they said that we will not carry out any action. And they even dared to use the memory of my grandparents and anyone else who suffered under the Nazis. So they dared to use the previous crime against humanity in order to justify, because of that and the sensitivity behind it, we will not deal with the ongoing crime against humanity that's happening right now. That's Amnesty International in Berlin, which are the petty villains, who claim to be a human rights organization, but they are the exact opposite of that. They are the exact enablers. They literally have the blood of Gaza on their hands. And finally, I will also mention the environmentalists here in Germany, who, since Greta Thunberg decided to speak up also about Palestine, they have totally distanced themselves from Greta, and they have distanced themselves from the global movement for environmental justice. So you see how in Germany, the whole twisted mentality behind it and what is happening, and these people who claim to work for the environment, who claim to work for human rights, who claim to work for the legacy of the White Rose, they are the ones who are obliterating their legacy and are working in order to support the criminals. Now, having said all of that, what can we do looking forward, and what about what's happening right now in Lebanon, the rest of the world? I think that we really have to hold these petty villains to account, because we can. And we obviously have at the same time to take action in order to hold the big villains to account and to demand that they go to the Hague. Basically, they will be taken to the Hague. And I mean, the amount of evidence is just unbelievable. It's unbearable, but it's also unbelievable. There's no shortage of evidence for the crimes. And yet the criminals carry on acting with almost full impunity. I'm saying almost because there is something happening in The Hague. Too late, too little, but something is happening. We have to demand that also the people in The Hague do what they're obligated to do. We have to demand of the politicians to do what they're obligated to do, but mostly we have to unite, just like the fascists of the world unite, and we see that happening very clearly. The anti-fascists of the world also have to unite against all these fascist forces. And I do think that it's possible. And I think that we are seeing that the most underprivileged, the poorest countries, the weakest of them all, they are the ones who stand up the most to Israeli crimes at the moment, which is amazing to see. We only need one country that's not, say, Yemen, or for that matter, Ireland or South Africa, to speak up. One European country to speak up. Just to do the bare minimum, and I believe that the dominoes will start falling. So this is kind of a little bit of an optimistic view, but I am optimistic about the fact that things will never be the same. Once Zionism has exposed itself for what it is, once the Haaretz propaganda machine. You know Haaretz newspaper, which is regarded as a newspaper. It's not. It's Israel's leading form of propaganda, and most sinister and dangerous form of propaganda. Real propaganda is not about making up facts. The real form of propaganda, the most effective form of propaganda, is not Der Stürmer, it's Haaretz. It's the one that tells you the facts, but covers it up in a whole other narrative, which is all about lending legitimacy to something that's absolutely illegitimate. So the notion that Israel is somewhat of a democracy, even though it doesn't have an iota of democracy, the notion that there is something legitimate and normal about a state that is absolutely illegitimate and abnormal and should not have been even admitted to the UN, and there's no reason not to expel it tomorrow from the UN. The notion that there is some form of legitimacy and normality is only because of the work of Haaretz, and this is what allowed the genocide to happen, because the rest of the world is looking at Israel as something that is not like North Korea, even though they are both just as democratic. And that has cracked. The propaganda of Haaretz has cracked. Personally, I say that we should celebrate the liberation of Palestine on the ruins of Haaretz newspaper offices. But putting that aside, the propaganda has cracked, and now it is really an opportunity to point the finger at what Israel is really all about. Nothing to do with 67, everything to do with 48. Also, the story of Gaza did not start in 67 and not later, it started in 48. And if we're able to point the finger at what really matters, then we will be able to change the situation and to hold those people to account.
Ronnie Barkan, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or see previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.